Okay, so let's get going. I have you looking at this interesting paper by seiji takeda. So Seiji Takeda is writing this hyper paraphrase series of philosophical texts. And in this case, he's writing about Husserl, the idea of phenomenology. And so Husserl's work, the idea of phenomenology, is really a series of lectures that was presented in 1907 at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Okay, so this was early in Husserl's career, having to do with the development of phenomenology. Okay, so the work of Takeda here, the hyper paraphrase, is really just to make difficult works more accessible. And so from experience, I've read Husserl in translation and know that his work is incredibly difficult to understand. And so this work of Takeda's is actually really helpful to help students get an accessible point by way of this paraphrase of Takeda's, okay? And so I'm helping you understand Takeda's paraphrase. So Takeda then presents what we understand as the three enigmas of philosophical inquiry. One is the enigma of being, two is the enigma of knowledge or cognition, three is the enigma of language. So the enigma of being has to do with why do we exist? Why is everything something and not nothing? Why did anyone create the world? Does God exist? Why am I myself, etc. So these questions of being are existential, so they're questions of existence. And then also being as a question in philosophy is an ontological question as well. So then we could understand this also as a metaphysical understanding of things. So seeking answers to questions such as these are often what get people interested in philosophy in the first place. So these are metaphysical questions. They're questions about being, and they're also existential questions, okay? So two, the enigma of knowledge, or otherwise known as the enigma of cognition, is, to be sure, we know that religion and philosophy have common threads of inquiry, yet philosophical inquiry usually aims for knowledge that is logical, well-reasoned, and away from basic reliance on faith-based knowledge, right? So, in other words, the enigma of being encompasses epistemological questions, such as, can we ever know the world in a genuine way? Also, we might start with philosophical questions such as what is being and what is experience in our first category, the enigma of being. And this takes us to epistemological questions, or an epistemological emphasis, whereby we could turn to the how. How can we be sure of such knowledge? In other words, how do we have such knowledge? How do we understand it? Is such knowledge reliable? Okay, so then, in other words, a metaphysical sense of our thinking is prior to our questions of knowledge, i.e., metaphysics is antecedent to epistemology as well. Okay, so then we have the enigma of language, number three. So following being and questions of being and cognition, we have, according to Takeda, whereby he highlights the enigma of language. So the enigma of language is easy to recognize that we have to acquire knowledge with our use of language. So, in other words, we have to acquire knowledge with our use of language, but yet rhetoric is not always an aim for truth, right? So language is not always aiming for truth, and language also, it straddles a subjective understanding in order to get to an objective understanding. So we could see how there's problem. The problem of language is interesting because we use language to express subjective states, to have an objective understanding of what those subjective states are. Okay, so then Takeda then believes that Husserl succeeded in elucidating the so-called enigma of cognition, perhaps leading to the elucidation of the other two enigmas, being and language. Okay, so recall that Husserl's elaboration of phenomenology led to breakthroughs in 20th century existentialism, and then also research methods. So there's phenomenological research methods. Also advancements in analytic philosophy as well. So Husserl straddles all these different spheres of philosophical thinking, but is relatively unknown to most people. But he's incredibly important because, as Takeda points out, he is elucidating the so-called enigma of cognition by way of phenomenology, right? So, but what is the enigma of cognition? So for Takeda, we start with the question, is it possible to know something in the first place, right? So herein we find the problem of relativism, right? So in other words, the problem of relativism, which shouldn't be necessarily be mistaken, but mistaken for ethical relativism, yet ethical relativism also shares with just relativism in general, relativism of truth. So in other words, the way that we consider relativism here is that the relativist is skeptical of or flat out denies the objectivity of truth, right? So in other words, for the relativist, truth is relative to whatever objective truth is not to be found. So in other words, whatever objective truth we claim, a relativist is claiming that, well, there's not necessarily a truth to that because it's all subjective, et cetera, okay? So they're denying objectivity to begin with. So then modern philosophy so shifting gears from relativism, modern philosophy is characterized by Descartes in the 16th century, then is distinguished by the sensual perception of things and objects known as res extensa for Descartes. In other words, extended things. So we have this one way of thinking about the world, and then we also have res cogitans, which is mental things that are not objects. So mental things are not objects, but the way we understand objects is by way of our mental cognition, our minds, and we access the res extensa, by way of rational thought. Rational thought only happens in the mind, okay? So it's a way of accessing objects, but the point really is that the objects themselves are not really completely understood by rational cognition, by way of the senses, because the senses cannot be relied upon, etc., right? And things occupy the domain of the senses. So rational thought is actually a step above objects, right? Because it's keying into that separation of the body and the mind, or objects and the mind, right? So this is working on the problem of cognition, but yet still for Descartes, we can never really truly access the things themselves because they are separate from the mind. So then Takeda asks, why is the enigma of cognition insoluble? So can we really be certain of the objective world apart from the challenges of dreaming and empirical perception? Right? So as we've learned with Descartes, such certainty is brought about by rational cognition or rational knowledge. Yet for Descartes, this did not bridge the gap between res extensa and or res cogit. It did not bridge the gap between res extensa and res cogitans. Okay, so rationalism in Descartes' hands reinforces mind-body dualism or mind-object dualism. So likewise, rationalists like Spinoza and Leibniz felt that the subject-object gap was to be bridged via rationalism. But yet empiricists like Hume or Berkeley felt that absolute knowledge of the outside objective world was impossible. So remember that even a rationalist way of understanding things is still just understanding things rationally. In other words, that rational cognition presents a limitation to the objects that we wish to understand by way of rational cognition, because rational thought doesn't fully access things in and of themselves. And so speaking of things in and of themselves, we have Immanuel Kant, who had what was termed the thing in itself, the so-called Ding an sich in German. So the Ding an sich is basically this idea that there are always parts of objects that cannot be observed, that don't appear to us. So these are outliers of cognition. So in other words, anytime I wish to access something that I'm thinking about, there's always, whatever it is I'm thinking about, there's always an outlier of that object that I'm not accessing by way of cognition, by way of rational cognition, etc. But in the world of appearances, things appear, but there's always something about things that does not appear to cognition. Might be another way of thinking about the problem of things in the thing in itself. Okay, so then switching to the methodological core of Husserl's phenomenology, we have the so-called phenomenological reduction. So this is at the center of our inquiry into solving the enigma of cognition. So the phenomenological reduction is otherwise known as the epoche, and this is a way of getting to the essence of cognition. Okay, it's getting to the essence of the enigma of cognition. So, in other words, the summary for the argument for Lecture 1 for Husserl is working on he's working on the enigma of cognition, and this is the center of doing philosophy according to Husserl. And so for Husserl, we have two different types of science. We have positive science, which is the typical way in which we understand scientific thinking. And then we also have philosophical science or phenomenological science, okay? So ultimately, philosophy as phenomenology will enable the resolution to the problems of positive science, which is steeped in the old-fashioned subject-object duality. And so a way to characterize this is the subject-object duality is basically this idea that when we're understanding things scientifically, we usually are just concerned with this idea that we got to just get to whatever, all the components of whatever that object is in order to better understand it. All of it. So, in other words, understanding the physics of it, et cetera, are going to get us to the better understanding of the object. Well, that's not quite the way that the phenomenological reduction works, okay? So, Husserl also was seeing that relativism and skepticism present a problem for this way of thinking, because the relativism still even assumes this subject-object relationship and is skeptical of the relationship between subject and object, there being a so-called objective truth that holds between the two, right? And so this is a threat to our understanding of things phenomenologically and philosophically for Husserl, okay? And he doesn't like this. So, right, so a relativist is skeptical of the relationship between the truth that holds between subject and object. So, So then we move to the summary of argument, the argument in lecture 2 from Husserl's The Idea of Phenomenology. So Husserl calls into question the so-called natural attitude. So the so-called natural attitude really is just this positivist, scientific way in which we understand the world as a subject-object relation. Okay? So in other words, we want to replace it with Husserl's sense of understanding, which is otherwise known as the immanence transcendence model. So immanence transcendence schema is basically what characterizes the phenomenological reduction. So Takeda thinks that this is too confusing to understand, but I admit that it's confusing, but it does elucidate just to get to some of the basic terms, right? So, in other words, there's, in the subject-object relationship, there's no need to, as far as phenomenology is concerned, there's no need to consider objective knowledge as a subject's reaching an object in and of itself. That, in other words, that idea of someone reaching an object in and of itself as a point of knowledge is not necessarily the concern for the phenomenologist. So Takeda, in his essay, places emphasis on the word belief. So this word belief really should be referring to appearance, because for phenomenology, a phenomenologist is looking at how the world appears, okay? And so this idea of appearance is key, because that's where we start thinking about parts and wholes, identity in a manifold, presence and absence. Those fundamental principles of phenomenology are the way that things appear to consciousness, to our consciousness, okay? So when we read the word belief as Takeda writes it, it really should be as the world appears to us, as the way the world appears to consciousness, okay? So since phenomenology is often referred to as the study of appearances, okay? And then the other word that we want to link into is immanence itself. So immanence has to do with the embodiment of conscious experience, which also requires a going beyond, otherwise known as a transcendence. So we could see that phenomenology is inherently metaphysical because we're going beyond things in order to understand them. But that going beyond is a focus on how things appear, okay? So in other words, what this is really boiling down to is the point that in order to understand consciousness, we have to understand that consciousness is always conscious of something, okay? And whatever it is that consciousness that we are conscious of is going to give us a picture of the way in which we understand things. In other words, the very particular way in which things appear to us is the way that we have knowledge of those things to begin with. So in other words, it's a way of inverting this subject-object relation to be something that is understood with our cognition. And so getting to the core, or the way these things are understood for our cognition, is what's important for the phenomenologist. The way a thing appears to us is how it is that we understand what that thing is, okay? And how it's important for our consciousness, and by extension, our knowledge of that thing. And so when we're talking about immanence, then we're thinking that it's important to focus on the very consciousness we have when it is that we are having a conscious experience of something. So that's what imminence means. In other words, imminence shouldn't be confused with that which is about to happen, right? So something that is imminent is about to happen, or eminent, like someone who is famous is an eminent personality. What we're thinking more is imminence as what? An indwelling, or something that is intrinsic to consciousness itself. In other words, getting to know things is getting to understand what consciousness is and how whatever it is that we're wanting to understand appears to consciousness. So that is what characterizes the epoche, otherwise known as the phenomenological reduction that Takeda is referring to, okay? So, in other words, phenomenology is also understood as the study of essences. So to get to the essence of what something is, we need to understand how it appears to us, how it appears to consciousness. How it appears to consciousness is in terms of parts and wholes, identity in a manifold, presence and absence, etc. When we understand those ways that things appear to us, we are getting to the essence of what that thing is, as it's understood in the first person consciously, right? By our very lived experience, that's how we understand knowledge of things, okay? So I think that gets us. So in other words, the essence of embodied consciousness is still a going beyond the object to emphasize how the object, person, idea appears experientially. So in other words, we have to go beyond the object in order to understand how it appears to us and how it's understood by us, right? In other words, to understand presence and absence is to understand what is present, and then likewise what is absent in the way that the objects appear to us as a means of understanding what that object is to our consciousness, okay? So I think that should get us to this preliminary understanding of Husserl's series of lectures, The Idea of Phenomenology, and help us to get to some of these basic tenets of phenomenology, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so thanks class, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.